Welcome to the Exploring Unschooling podcast. I'm Pam Laricchia, longtime unschooling mom and author. Join me and my wonderful guests for interviews, information, and inspiration about unschooling and living joyfully with your family. You can find the episode show notes, your free introductory ebook, What is Unschooling, and lots more information at livingjoyfully.ca. And here's the show. Hello, everyone. I'm Pam Laricchia, and this is episode number 81 of the podcast. It's the 19th of July, 2017, as I record this intro. And this week, the book chat is back. Emma Marie Forde and I chat about the book The Gardener and the Carpenter, What the New Science of Child Development Tells Us About the Relationship Between Parents and Children by Alison Gopnik. Emma and I both really enjoyed the book and have a fun time chatting about it through the lens of unschooling. There's really interesting stuff there. As a personal update, I'm happily back to juggling my three favorite balls at the moment. This podcast, writing my book about the unschooling journey, and working with Anne and Anna to create the online version of the Childhood Redefined Unschooling Summit. They are all really long-term projects, but I have a deadline now to get my book to my editor by the middle of August, so that's some extra motivation there. And Michael's on vacation this week. He drove down to New York City to visit Lissy and Jacob, and it sounds like they're having a great time. And I'd like to thank everyone who has chosen to support the show on Patreon. A big welcome to new patrons, Phoebe Spanier, Lizzie Ware, and Dan Kadzow. Thanks so much for joining us. The private group for patrons is now up and running, and it'll be fun to hear what they think about the book and my conversation with Emma this week. If you'd like to support the show, even for as little as $1 a month, check out the Exploring Unschooling page at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/exploring unschooling. And this week's quote is from Alison Gopnik from the book. The mind of a human child working in concert with the minds of the people caring for him is the most flexible and powerful learning device in the known universe. And I think she nails it here. Children thrive and learn like crazy when they feel secure and safe engaging with people that care about them, meaning they trust them. It's what unschooling parents see unfolding right in front of them every day. It's so interesting to me when academic research happens upon the same findings that we see in our lives. It reminds me of something Brené Brown shared in her book, Rising Strong. Today, I proudly call myself a researcher storyteller because I believe the most useful knowledge about human behavior is based on people's lived experiences. We are living our lives with our children, and what we glean about human behavior through our experiences is useful and valid knowledge. It's also really fun, as you'll hear in our conversation today, when there are so many connections between what we observe about children and what others are seeing, which is the case with a lot of the research that Alison talks about in this book. So it's not about validating our experiences, because our experiences are valid all on their own, but about finding connections that weave alongside our observations, making these truths about children and learning all the more stronger. Pretty often in unschooling circles, we talk about how the conclusions from studies on children's behavior are suspect because they are studying school-age children, which means that artificial environment is hardwired into the results. And that always reminds me of Carol Black's classic quote, "Collecting data on human learning based on children's behavior in school is like collecting data on killer whales based on their behavior at SeaWorld." But in this case, Alison studies young children before they hit school age. So it's really interesting to see that a lot of her findings mesh so well with the experiences of countless unschooling families. We know that the incredible learning she finds with young children, seeing them as natural scientists, extends to older children as well, as long as they aren't acculturated into the conventional school system. It makes sense, right? And now let's get on to the book chat with Emma. Hi, Hi everyone, I'm Pam Laricchia from livingjoyfully.ca, and today I'm here with Emma Marie Forde. Hi Emma.
Hi Pam.
Hello, it is so nice to have you back for another book chat episode. These are really fun.
Yeah, thanks. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. I really enjoyed this one. Anyway, so to let you guys know, this time Emma and I are talking about The Gardener and the Carpenter, what the new science of child development tells us about the relationship between parents and children, by Alison Gopnik, and it was published last year. So a bit of info, Alison is a psychology professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and her research explores how young children come to know the world around them. She's written a number of books, including The Philosophical Baby, What Children's Minds Tell Us About Truth, Love, and the Meaning of Life, and The Scientist in the Crib, Minds, Brains, and How Children Learn. So I wanted to share with you guys the book description for The Gardener and the Carpenter. Caring deeply about our children is part of what makes us human. Yet the thing we call, quote, parenting is a surprisingly new invention. In the past 30 years, the concept of parenting and the multi-billion-dollar industry surrounding it have transformed childcare into obsessive, controlling, and goal-oriented labor intended to create a particular kind of child and therefore a particular kind of adult. In the book, Alison Gopnik argues that the familiar 21st century picture of parents and children is profoundly wrong. It's not just based on bad science, it's bad for kids and parents too. Drawing on the study of human evolution and her own cutting-edge scientific research into how children learn, Gopnik shows that although caring for children is profoundly important, it is not a matter of shaping them to turn out a particular way. Children are designed to be messy and unpredictable, playful and imaginative, and very different both from their parents and from each other. The variability and flexibility of childhood lets them innovate, create, and survive in an unpredictable world. Parenting won't make children learn, but caring parents let children learn by creating secure, loving environments. Now, that sounds pretty interesting, right? Now, I'm just going to start us off by talking about the two models of parenting that she's talking about, the gardener and the carpenter. With the carpenter model, parents are working with the goal of producing a particular kind of adult. They are essentially trying to shape their child into a final product that fits what the vision they had in mind to begin with. So for them, parenting is about control. And there are many parenting how-to books these days that promise if you do X, Y, and Z, that will make a substantial difference in the way your child turns out. And this idea is so pervasive and seductive that conventionally, at least, it almost seems self-evident, right? That's, of course, the way you parent. And Alison explains that this parenting model is also the default model for much of education. She makes a great point that nowadays, when people become parents, they typically have had lots of experience with schooling, but little experience with caregiving. So when parents or policymakers hear her talk and other scientists that she does research with talk about how much children learn, the people listening, they often conclude that, well, then we should teach them even more because they learn so well. And they assume that we should be teaching them the way they do in school. And she writes, quote, but children actually learn more from the unconscious details of what caregivers do than from any of the conscious manipulations of parenting. So that's Carpenter parenting there. And on the other hand, when we garden, we create a protected and nurturing space for plants to flourish. She explains that a good garden is constantly changing as it adapts to the changing circumstances, and a good gardener, quote, works to create fertile soil that can sustain a whole ecosystem of different plants with different strengths and beauties, and with different weaknesses and difficulties too. So in this way, being a good parent won't transform children into smart or happy or successful adults, but it can help create a new generation that is robust and adaptable and resilient, better able to deal with the inevitable, unpredictable changes that face them in the future. Now, she also dives into the rewards of being a parent, and it's not your child's grades or trophies. Quote, they come from the moment-by-moment physical and psychological joy of being with this particular child, in that child's moment-by-moment joy in being with you. She says, the purpose of loving children in particular is to give those helpless young human beings a rich, stable, safe environment, an environment in which variation, innovation, and novelty can blossom. And then by the end of the introduction to the book, she set us up with this. So our job as parents is not to make a particular kind of child. Instead, our job is to provide a protected space of love, safety, and stability in which children of many unpredictable kinds can flourish. Our job is not to shape our children's minds. It's to let those minds explore all the possibilities that the world allows. Our job is not to tell children how to play. It's to give them the toys and pick the toys up again after the kids are done. We can make children learn. We can't make children learn, but we can let them learn. So I was just kind of in love by the end of the introduction, because that sounds so much like the same kind of attitude and perspective that unschooling parents bring to the table and to their relationships with their children, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I thought this, it was great, really. I mean, it really fits so well with unschooling, the approach and the research, really, which I thought was really interesting. I really enjoyed it.
I know. I love the way she's talking about moving away from control over children to like nurturing them from underneath. Because for me, that's kind of how I've always seen it. You know, the controlling. They talk about helicopter parenting, right? And to me, that's always like hovering above, trying to control things. And with unschooling, I always talk about how we're foundational support, helping from underneath the roots, supporting from below rather than controlling from above. So I really loved her gardening analogy because I thought that really fit well.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking there's a few ideas there. I mean, one of them is about, being like a gardener and creating an ecosystem where you're really focusing on, like the environment that you're creating for your children. So, like it's, and part of that is, one of the main parts of that is the relationship, which I think Alison sort of like really picked up on throughout the book. And I think that's the part for me which really fits well with unschooling, and also in terms of nurturing the relationship and your child's emotional development. And it really fits in with, that learning emerges really from, the relationship between the parent and the child, and actually teaching a child is actually counterproductive. So I thought that was, the analogy of the gardener, she picked up on so many important points through that.
I know what's really cool is when you think about it as the environment and as a garden. And she talked about the wide variety of, flowers and plants and that can grow. So it so well encompasses the whole creating an environment for your child to thrive in that, if they're introverted, extroverted, or wherever they are on that scale in the moment, just the wide variety of individual children. And she talks so much about how you're connecting with this individual child, right? And that's who you're gardening for. I mean, yeah, because when I said it that way, that seems like a little bit more controlling, as in you're trying. Oh, she came up with hot housing, right? When you're trying to garden for a particular kind of plant, right? That's not what you're getting at either, because that's the whole point, that children grow and change over time, right? So you don't know. you'll be pleasantly surprised, when this blossom comes up or what direction the next branch grows to, right? I just love how open the analogy is.
Yeah, and kind of the idea of a wild garden as well. I really, I like that, where you want lots of different plants thriving, and that's what makes it really the whole environment, it is nurturing unique and individual children. And that in terms of in evolutionary history, you don't want everyone to be the same. You want diversity and difference, because that's what actually enables us to thrive. And I think that's what she was saying throughout childhood, that it's actually beneficial to have, you don't want all the children to be the same, learning all the same things at the same time. You actually want to sort of like facilitate and nurture the development of different aspects of a child's personality and the things that they're interested in. And it's through that diversity that cultural innovation and change really becomes possible. So I really liked that kind of aspect to it.
Yeah, because it's an analogy that works on all levels, right? Like from individual child right through childhood per se, and the diversity of a generation of children as well. I thought that was really cool. I really liked a point she made too about how trying to shape their children into worthy adults becomes a great source of anxiety and guilt and frustration for parents, right? Yet that is what we're all feeling pressured to do. We see that everywhere. And that for this kind of parenting for children, it leads to, she called it an oppressive cloud of hovering expectations. Mm-hmm. And we talk about how expectations get in the way so much. So it was really cool to see her make that connection as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I thought, it's really interesting how I think when we consciously try and sort of teach children, and it actually, it kind of shuts them down rather than enabling them to open up and explore, the world and the things that they're interested in, and how Alison really sort of takes us through some of the research that's showing actually how children are learning sort of like implicitly and intuitively in relationships every day. So it's not kind of so much about what we are consciously trying to teach them, but what they're actually picking up all the time.
I really liked how she did describe quite a bit of the research, right? And how it was set up. And I found it really interesting to read, to see how they managed to get, below the directions to allow to observe the child freely, like making choices, and to be able to set up inferences for them, right? Because that's how you saw them learning, them figuring things out. And they saw young kids figuring out so much stuff. That's why, when we talk to unschooling parents and we say, relax the control for a bit and watch your children. And that this is what they're going to see, right? They're going to see their kids being so capable in situations and picking up so much information and using it so intelligently. But when we're so busy trying to control them, we never give them the space to do that, right? So that's why, it's just like, relax for a bit. It's the weekend for like the next 6 months. Yeah. And watch your kids, because it's amazing. And so, it was really fun reading about her experiments. The other thing I found really interesting was in the chapter on the evolution of childhood, Alison writes, quote, "The mind of a human child working in concert with the minds of the people caring for him is the most flexible and powerful learning device in the known universe." And what I found really interesting was her description of how natural learning and cultural transmission encourages feedback loops. It caught my attention because a couple of weeks ago I was talking to Dan Kadzow, and he also talked about cultural transmission. And you can tell in one of her previous books, Alison describes children as little scientists, always experimenting to learn more about both their physical and their psychological world. They try something, they see what happens, and then they incorporate that experience moving forward. That's how we talk about learning so much with unschooling, and that's what she's meaning too by feedback loops. So when she talks about children from an evolutionary perspective, she explains that trying to consciously shape how your children will turn out is futile and self-defeating because we can't know what kind of challenges our children will face in the future. So if we're trying to, Carpenter work them into either our own image or the image of our current ideals, we might actually keep them from adapting to changes in the future. And what I loved about that quote was it got me twice when I was reading it, because she wrote, in the image of our current ideals. And that so hits it on the head, because so often we expect perfection of our children, even when, and sometimes especially when, we can't reach it ourselves, right? We want our children to be better than we are or were, right? So much pressure on them. And then the second piece, it reminded me of the quote it's often attributed to Alvin Toffler, but in his book Future Shock, he was quoting Herbert Gurdjieff. Anyway, he wrote, "The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn." And she emphasizes just what incredible learners children are through watching and listening and imitating and trying things out. All the things that unschooling parents see in action every day. And that the ability to learn flexibly and to adjust to new circumstances are more important than ever. And that the relationship between parents and children are key to creating that nourishing environment in which children can thrive. And that sounds so similar, doesn't it? Like, we're always talking about the importance of the relationship, that, you don't even have to look at the learning or look for the learning. When you focus on that strong relationship with your child, all the rest of that stuff flows.
Yeah. I mean, that's partly what I felt was so interesting about the book, as well as about how much children are learning, through the relationship, and how they're learning sort of like unconsciously and intuitively. And one of the research studies that she mentioned in the book was looking at the different attachment styles, and how, it's the type of relationship that you have with your child actually influences how they learn, like, from you. So they were looking at, they looked at children's attachment at a year old, and then again at 4 years old. And they found that the children who had a secure attachment were more likely to learn from their parent, versus a stranger. And equally, and whereas the children that had like an avoidant attachment, which meant that more of an insecure type of attachment with their parent, were equally likely to learn from a stranger or their parent. And it's just quite interesting in terms of, what that says about, like the importance of nurturing relationships with our children. And, like, as you mentioned, unschooling, we really focus on that. And it's something that Gordon Neufeld sort of talks quite a bit about as well. He's a sort of a clinical psychologist and a developmental theorist and researcher. And he always emphasizes, how important it is, whether a child sort of really learns at home or at school, that they have that connection and that attachment with, whether it's with their parent or their teacher, because that's how children learn. And I think this is what Alison was saying in the book, in which the research shows, is that how, like, we're really designed to learn, like from our parents and the people that we're close to. And
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to, and that's how, like we build on cultural traditions, that we learn about, like the what's important in our culture. And we how sensitive children really are to picking up cues from the adults around them, and just that's how they're learning all the time.
Yeah, that's a huge piece. You know what's interesting from what you said? I can't remember when reading that piece how avoidant attachments are more likely to learn from other people other than their parents, right? Because you've got that avoidant. And that's almost, when they talk about separating, how important it is to separate from your child when they go to school, right? Mm-hmm. Because they need to kind of break that attachment so that the child will start learning from somebody else. Mm-hmm. That was very curious.
Yeah. And I think that's another important point, is that when children go to school, I don't know what it's, in the UK, there's usually, say, you've got 28, 30, maybe 35 children, like to one teacher in the class. Yeah. And so you're thinking about, like, if a child learns best when they're attached to someone in a relationship with them, like, not all of those children are going to probably form a close attachment with that teacher. And so they're not, it leaves them more vulnerable. Whereas at home, it's possible to create a, more nurturing attachment. So you've got that connection. I think sometimes like in schools, the importance of that relationship can get lost, and it's so fundamental for learning, really. But then you see in schools that children aren't, necessarily always able to learn, like as effectively as they might if they were feeling sort of secure and attached.
Yeah, that was one thing that stood out for me in the book, because she talks quite a bit, and mentions those relationships between children and child care workers and teachers. She gave them a name. She called them allo parents, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so she talks about that bond that develops, which makes sense on the surface. But, when you think about it, like you said, in the classroom and in childcare environments, I think it seems like the reality is that with so many kids to manage, those adults who are caring for children don't have the time to develop a secure enough bond with each individual child, right? I mean, mm-hmm. That really, even years ago when my kids were at school, that isn't something that I saw. Even then there was still, 27, 30, 35 kids in a classroom, and it was all about classroom management. It wasn't about trying to create bonds mm-hmm. and connections, like mm-hmm. connection being even lighter kind of bond. That wasn't, it was all about managing the child's behavior and their activities, what they were doing, not about trying to create a connection with them that would help them learn, really, right? Mm-hmm.
And it seems that it's also, and when you haven't got those connections, it's harder, I think, children thrive when they're feeling secure and attached. So when they're not, when they're not feeling attached and connected, then it's harder for them to learn, because they're not as relaxed and playful and exuberant as they might be otherwise.
Yeah, it's like you can't, you don't feel safe enough to relax and kind of get in the flow of the moment or the activity to learn, because you're always kind of feeling protective. You always have to watch out for your environment, who might be teasing who, or, what the teacher means by this. It just seems like you always have to kind of wear a protective shell in a classroom. Mm. Or wear a personality that fits best, you're kind of mm-hmm. hiding behind whatever the kind of perfect student you're supposed to be in that environment that the teacher's looking for, right?
Yeah, and I guess that's where she did sort of talk about as well, about how, variability in the classroom isn't always nurtured or valued, and that what can happen is that students that maybe have a different kind of attention focus, or maybe learning to read at a different rate, or in a different, like in a different way or a different speed. Sometimes they can be, kind of picked out and labelled as having some kind of learning difference or disability. Yeah. And that's, like that we're not really valuing variability within those contexts, and so that it can become sort of medicalized or pathologized, when actually it would be more a better idea to kind of encourage that variability. And I think that's something in the education system, as it currently is in many cases, that it means that that those opportunities aren't there, which is, I guess, one of the reasons why I think unschooling is such a, like a wonderful thing, is because you can really encourage, like each child's individuality, and you can really nurture their interests and passions in a way that is very difficult like in a more sort of mainstream context, when there's lots of other children who are also wanting to, who need to be cared for and looked after at the same time.
Yeah, no, you can't focus on, I guess that's why, the bond and the connection, it's really not an environment where you can even expect an individual teacher to be able to individualize things, right? So that's why it doesn't work out that way. And yeah, I really loved her discussion about variability and why that's so valuable. And she did go quite a bit, right, into the whole evolutionary perspective and talking about different animals and stuff, and how they learn, and their relationships with their parents. And yeah, that was all really interesting stuff that she shared.
Because I thought when she talked about the animals, I know she mentioned about the sort of like the Caledonian crows, and how they actually have a longer period of infancy, infancy than other animals, and that they're actually more intelligent than when you sort of like contrast with a lot of other species, and they spend a lot of those first 2 years playing and experimenting and exploring their environment, also tool use, and how the parents are really there to sort of facilitate that, and they're patient, and they they provide that sort of holding context so that they can experiment and explore, and the parents provide during that time.
I love that piece. When she was talking about how the parents, the mother, the crows, they let the kids play with the tools, and they use them wrong so many different times, right? And that was okay, because they're just figuring it out eventually. Yeah, I loved the discussion and the contrast with the varying lengths of childhood, basically, right? Of dependence, right? As you said, they feed their children, their baby crows, longer than other animals do, because the skills that they want their baby crows to develop take time, right?
Yeah.
And that was an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. And the longer, I think what's nice about that is that, the more I guess the crows who show more sort of ability to problem solve and to develop their sort of skills, and they're learning, all the time from the environment and from changes in the environment, that there's much more sort of flexibility and openness and potential to deal with change. And how, I guess Alison was talking about how really in human childhood, it makes more sense to foster those abilities and to provide us a context where we can actually stand back and allow a child more freedom to explore and experiment. And I think the research that she was drawing on really showed actually that when a teacher, they had children in an experimental situation where there was a toy, for example, that had different uses. When a teacher explained those sort of to the children, they were then less likely to explore the other things that the toy could do. So it kind of drew their focus and attention to certain things rather than sort of like enabling them to have a more open, like relationship to what they were exploring. And I think that, I mean, she gave lots of examples like that throughout the book, which showed, sometimes when the parent can sort of provide space and a nurturing environment, that children actually are more likely to explore and learn and enrich them, like what they know. So I thought that was quite well.
Yeah, it was super cool because it was so interesting to see the way they set it up and what they saw, because I see that, now that my kids are older, having grown up unschooling and not being told exactly how to use something, in that when they and their friends approach a new situation, I see their schooled friends just kind of hang back and wait to be told what to do. Whereas unschooled kids and, my kids and other unschooled kids I've seen out and about are just so much more proactive. They'll go and they'll try something and they'll experiment, or they'll go ask someone, or they'll figure, they're comfortable just to continue to explore. There was a point where she talked about how it was American children, and I forget the other nationality, but that because American parenting nowadays is so Carpenter focused, they saw that American kids will just sit back and wait to be told what to do or how to do something, because it's happened to them enough times. They know that's kind of the only way, right? They just wait. They don't observe the situation, the environment, pick out this. They don't see the clues that are in their environment. There are always so many clues around us for things. And it was amazing to see that when people are observing, they see the same thing that we see with unschooled and schooled kids, that schooled kids will just kind of wait until they're told what to do, when to do it, however, versus noticing all the things that are going on around them. They don't see so much in their environment because they just don't bother looking. They're just waiting around to be told.
Yeah, and I think I know the bit that you mean there, where I think it was in Indian children, and she was sort of saying how in some of those experiments that they did, that the American children were more likely to wait until the teacher was ready to teach them, whereas the children from the Indian culture were more likely to be learning while their sibling was, learning already.
They would pay attention when somebody else was being shown something, and they would already have it figured out by the time it was their turn. Whereas the other kids wouldn't even be paying attention to somebody else being shown things. They're just waiting their turn. Yeah, that was so fascinating.
It is, and I think it's really interesting how powerful culture can be in shaping even things like our attention and our focus. So, providing children with different, opportunities to learn a different way of being can actually really influence those kind of things on on an unconscious level, and also on a cultural, level. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it really is. I want to jump back just a little bit because you mentioned this in passing a bit ago, and it's something that we talk pretty regularly in the Q&A episodes about how our children so often pick up so much from us, even when we don't explicitly say anything, right? It's maybe in our body language, even our word choices or our tone. And I really did love that Alison mentioned that as well. She wrote, in some ways, at least, your children may actually know more about you than you do yourself. Children are tuned in to details of how parents act that you may not even notice. For example, preschoolers notice whether you say, let's see what this does, or let me show you what this does. That ties into what we were just talking about. It's the way we culturally present things, right? And it reminded me the episode last week, Kelly shared a story about how one of her young acting students, after watching her in a TV show, came back the next week to class and mentioned that he was surprised to hear that her voice was the same, realizing that she doesn't talk to them in a teacher voice because he's just so used to the adults having a teacher voice. And so many of them, I know, we would, very nicely tease my sister-in-law because she had a teacher voice when she was talking to the younger kids. But she didn't even notice that she was doing it, right? It's just something so natural. But kids pick all that stuff up. They can really, really pick up the nuances of a situation so well. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think she went on to say something like that they might know actually what you mean better than you do yourself. That they're all the time. They're alert and sensitive and picking up these cues that we probably aren't. You can't actually really be aware of all the time on a conscious level. And she's saying that's how it should be. That it's more helpful to actually just focus on the relationship and who you are as a person, with your children and like the relationship, than it is actually to focus on sort of specific sort of teaching strategies.
I think that's why so much of moving to unschooling is all like the parents' internal work, right? It's all about figuring out who we want to be in this relationship, right? And realizing all the different ways we are inadvertently exerting control. Because that is the right way for kids to learn, right? Because that's the reality. If that's the tone of your voice, that's what you really think. Right? If that's the teacher voice that you slide into when you're talking with kids, you're treating them as a different kind of or class of person, right? They can tell. This is their reality. So what they're learning isn't wrong. What they're learning is real. It's just us learning. Is that what we intend? Is understanding these things that we may be projecting, and is that what we mean, and is that something that we would like to change? So much of moving to unschooling for me was observing myself too, right? So that and taking that moment before an automatic reaction or an automatic just phrase that comes out or whatever, to align my intentions with my actions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It really makes sense. And I think part of before having children, I had sort of psychotherapy as part of sort of trying to process some of the ways of relating and sort of being with other people, and trying to make sort of more conscious things in my life that perhaps had been unconscious, but even those unconscious things can actually determine how you behave and relate to other people if you're not really aware of it. And I know that I think Alison was really saying in the book, you don't need to be aware of all this stuff really. This is going to be happening anyway, but I do agree that it can be helpful to be as reflective as you possibly can to avoid going down some of the some of the issues or routes, or maybe if you are used to talking in a kind of a teacherish way or being sort of more directive, if you can become aware of that, I think it can help, because then it leaves a bit more space open for different ways of relating to emerge.
Well, I think, and the other piece too is focusing on that relationship and that connection, you get to a point as well where your kids will point these things out to you too, right?
Yeah, definitely.
That's right. You are you. But, we can always strive to be the kind of parent and person that we want to be, right? We're always growing and changing forever, I think. So definitely there were times too when my kids would point something out. I'm like, oh, let's do that over. That's kind of not what I meant or whatever. But that's the great thing about the relationship is when you're that well connected and the relationship is trusting and open enough that you can have these conversations that they feel comfortable mentioning when they notice something. I think that's great too. And it's another feedback loop, right? When she was talking about learning from your environment, and how you learn about the people that you're with, their observations about how they're receiving whatever you're saying or doing is another feedback loop. Hey, I didn't really mean for you to take that from what I said or did. So I'm going to learn that for next time I might try something different, right?
Yeah. And I guess that's where the variability comes into it as well, so that you don't have to, not everything needs to be prescribed, but if you can have that space and the dialogue, it allows new possibilities to emerge. I guess I was good. Sorry, I was just saying in conversations, which is that okay if I just say that it reminds me because they do talk, she did talk in the book about some research that they've done, and there was something called the child's CHILDS DES child's database, and how they looked at 6,000 early questions that conversations actually between parents and children, and how the children were asking, like 4-year-olds were asking questions, and they wanted to know really, why were they asking these questions, they looked at all these conversations and analysed them, and they found that the children really were wanting to have their questions answered, but they wanted to have them answered in a meaningful way, with reasonable explanations. And so that they could see that the children were actually deepening their knowledge. And so they weren't just asking it, for any reason. It was just that they genuinely were wanting to learn, and it was shown how actually naturally curious children are. And how within those kind of questions and answers in the conversations, there was so much rich learning that was taking place. And that kind of really reminded me of some work that I'd read by Alan Thomas, who's a UK, he's a clinical he's a developmental psychologist, but he's looked into home education quite substantially, and he's looked at how parents and children learn at home. And he says in his research that one of the main ways that children are learning is through these sort of like conversations that happen every day, from when you get up in the morning at breakfast, just chat, just all the time. That's where the learning's taken place. So I thought that was quite interesting that Alison mentioned about this research and how that kind of fits there.
Yeah, no, I really love that too, because we see that, but you hear so many people are, they feel like their kids are just kind of being more annoying than it when they ask, why, over and over again. But they saw that they were really, truly curious and wanted to know those answers, and kept wanting to dig and dig and dig until it made sense for them, right? Mm-hmm. And we see that so often with unschooling kids. When you haven't, what's that study that a toddler has hears the word no like 300 times a day or something like that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's crazy how much. And Dan mentioned this too, how much we shut them down when they're younger, mm-hmm. right? And try to make them almost like like adults, right? We want seen and not heard kind of deal. And we want to stop their exploration. No. And then on the other end of the scale, when they're teenagers, we want to keep them under control, right? The opposite of letting them start to spread their wings when they're ready, etc. But yeah, it was really interesting, the stuff she was sharing about those conversations, because when it's again what we ask parents who want to come to unschooling, move to unschooling, to give their children that space and to be available for those conversations. And the important thing is being available when the child asks, because that's when they're curious. Right? Not putting them off. Oh, we'll look at that after dinner or whenever. Yeah, sometimes that is necessary. Sometimes you really are. But so often we just knee-jerk say no later. Right? To realize that when they're curious in that moment, that's when they're going to learn so much about it, because that's where their brain is spinning right now, right?
Yeah. One of the things, because when I was reading this a little while ago, I actually got a little notebook and started to write down Lily and Rose's questions, because I realised that every day, from almost in the moment they wake up, they're asking questions, and some of them I can't always answer. So, because maybe I just don't know, but I think the key for me is like trying to, or not, taking what they're asking seriously and sort of saying, maybe I don't know what the answer is to that, but we can find out together. So I started to collect all their questions so that, because often actually sometimes it would happen when we were driving somewhere and they'd have all these questions like, what is it? Why is Sunday called Sunday? Or, when we like, do tigers mate the life? And just like, look, there were so many questions that were coming up, and I just thought I need to kind of try and hold on to some of these, because it felt like, like some of it is in the moment and some of it's nice to be able to go back and say, I've had a look at this, or should we have a look at this together, and kind of exploring things together like that. So, yeah, because I think when, when children ask lots of questions, there is a tendency to feel, I haven't got time for that. I don't, it's not serious, or maybe even sometimes think about it in dismiss those questions. And I just think it's really important to show and to communicate that you are taking those questions seriously. And I think that's what this research with the database was really showing that, children's questions are serious, and when they're answered in a way that's meaningful and explanatory, that they will then move on to something else, and then actually they'll ask maybe more questions that are deeper in a different way. So I thought it was really interesting how she, by drawing on the research, she really picks up on how children are learning, like the processes that are happening in these everyday kind of conversations, which is what kind of unschooling is kind of all about.
I know, that was the coolest thing. Like, there were just so many connections with unschooling. And when she was, she's diving into relationships, she's diving into how young children learn. And so much of it is what we see in action with our kids, right? That was just so interesting to me. And that's the one thing I find fascinating, that through research they can discover all these things that we see happen naturally, yet I'm going, so why don't they do anything about this, if this is how children learn and how it helps to support their learning, etc. But that's why I pulled out that quote that she said, that when she goes around and she talks to parents and teachers, etc., at school, principals, etc., that they take the message that they take away is, oh, well, we need to teach them more then.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how we just see through our lens, right? It's so hard. I mean, and look how long it takes for us to start to break away the school lens that we bring to it. We talk about deschooling needing probably for parents at least a year for the majority of it. There's always going to be new issues that come up down the road, right? Because the conventional messages are just around us and are so strong. But it's fascinating to see how people bring their filter and see everything through that filter. And you know what was fascinating for me? Okay, so I'm going to jump here because Alison too still had that filter, because she so clearly explains the negative effects of the conventional Carpenter parenting style and gives lots of snippets from her study showing how well children learn and grow into themselves with the Gardner style parent. And on top of that, she talks about many of the challenges of the school system and how it closely mimics the Carpenter parenting model. And yet not once does she mention homeschooling, let alone unschooling, right? So I wanted to share just a couple of the school-related quotes because I thought they were fascinating and interesting. One of them, she writes, "A standardized test score is the apotheosis of the goal-directed, child-shaping carpentry picture of schooling. The idea that schools should be designed to turn all children into creatures with particular characteristics. What schools do best is teach children how to go to school. Instead, schools should be places where children can genuinely exercise their continuing capacities for discovery. They should be places where children can master real-world skills." And interestingly, she goes on to describe reading, writing, and calculating as scholastic skills. So she separates them from real-world skills. But I mean, so many of us unschooling parents have seen that those skills are woven into our culture. And we've seen that they too can be learned just by being in the real world. They're part of our culture, and those skills will come up and be of interest for kids, and they will pick them up. There was this piece about her observation of students in her college classes. So she wrote, "By the time they arrive in our classes, many Berkeley undergraduates are absolute matahoros of test taking. It's no wonder we're gravely disappointed and they are resentfully surprised when we ask them to actually be apprentice scientists or scholars instead." And that's just another way of showing why unschoolers who choose to go to college are so often appreciated by their college professors, because they grew up continuing to be the apprentice scientists that Alison sees in young children, rather than taking the rest of their childhood and being sidetracked in the school system kind of learning. So not learning about the world, but learning about how to be a good student. And then lastly, there's this one. "We also shouldn't think of preschool only in terms of school readiness, as if the only point of caring for young children is to make them into older children who will do better in the particular strange institution of school." So all that makes it so curious to me that her solution, but it so often seems to be the case with academics, is to try and change the school system, right? She says that school is more and more essential for success. So, like, to me, that seemed to be where I think she's stuck, because inside the system, it probably looks that way. But from outside, we're moving further and further away from that, right? And I think it's also using a very conventional definition of the idea of success, right? But so for me, and for anyone who reads the book, I think because of what we've been talking about all before this moment, when you're talking with them, it's pretty easy to talk about how all these changes that she's talking about, the way children learn and being able to, how we can support children's learning, not try to control it, the value of the relationship, etc., that this is not the way the school system is. And, we're choosing unschooling because this is the way we want to live with our children right now, right? I just thought that was just so fascinating that she had all this research that she's been doing, and she has all these interesting observations about the school system itself and how that's not working and not meshing with the way children learn, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And yet school is still where she ended up staying.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, and I guess slightly frustrating because it was a critique, wasn't it, really, of sort of mainstream dominant sort of cultural narrative around school and education that she provided. And she didn't really move beyond that. I guess it was a critique. I didn't feel that
that she was going for solutions.
Yeah, I guess.
Except for the part where she said school is more and more essential for success. Like, how does that match?
Yeah. I guess I was thinking about the examples she gave of companies like Google and Pixar, and how they've cultivated sort of play spaces into their everyday, environments, and sort of seeing, really focusing on the importance of the environment and making opportunities to play, and for people like parents to facilitate children's play as being beneficial. But yeah, all of this.
Well, that's both ends of it, right?
Yeah.
So with young children and at work.
Yeah.
But you're still stuck with and even like she said, in college they're looking for that creative, curious, kind of student. They don't want the rote student, but that, as she says, the students that show up there are just waiting to be told what to do, to study what they're told and do well on the test. That's what they've been trained to do. As she said, they've been trained to be a student, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And I guess she didn't really step outside of, she critiqued the narrative, but didn't sort of necessarily step outside it. I think that's what you're picking up on, that given all these faults, like that would suggest a revolution rather than sort of more of the same, or something slightly different, but maybe a paradigm shift.
Well, yeah, I think the challenge is that just doing little small changes inside the system is like to assume that from working inside and just doing a little bit of tweak here, a little bit of tweak there, let me tell them how I see children really learning and they're going to change the environment for them. That seems to be a bit of an unrealistic expectation. Now, personally, I'm not saying everybody should be homeschooled or anything like that. But I think that's also why we're seeing, maybe it's just through my lens that I'm seeing this, but, you've got the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, you've got that are trying to bring together all the different kinds of learning environments that are out there, agile learning centers, Sudbury schools, all these different and school environments, as in a place that a child goes without their parents. So those are also possibilities. But I was just surprised you didn't once mention any of those other possibilities. You know what I mean?
No.
But yeah, it could be that, she was just staying in the critique mode for the most part. And she did a fascinatingly good job with that.
Yeah. No, because when you mentioned that, I think what I felt what she was emphasizing was how much we learn from relationships and how much we learn from things that are happening all the time. Not to focus on, the focus on explicit teaching is really quite misleading. That we're, grandparents, parents, friends, relatives, these people are rich sources of learning for children and for adults, and for all of us really throughout our lives, and that it's happening all the time unconsciously, and that we're going down the wrong path really if we think that being explicitly taught is actually the way to go. I thought, because she gave some examples at school of how, the teachers actually say, they're not asking questions, and she says yes, but are they interested in their friends and their, like, are they interested in what's happening and who likes who? And they say, oh yes, they're very fascinated in that, but we don't actually want to talk about that here. That's not what we're here for. So yeah, just kind of,
well, that's it. As we say, children are always learning, just maybe not learning if you're trying to control it, they may not be learning what you're trying to teach them, right? They're forever. They're always picking up things, right? They're always figuring things out. What was I going to say? It was, yeah. And when, I guess also when you realize, even if, school needs to be in the picture, right? That's, maybe you don't have an alternative kind of school nearby or whatever. But if you understand that children are always learning, and you can break that attachment to the school style, right? You can still be actively supporting your children's learning when they're at home, when they're with you. You can have that close and connected relationship with them, and be learning them, helping them learn all the time. And they're still learning at school the things that they're picking up. So so for a parent's perspective, that would be, not focusing on the grades. The grades aren't a judge of you as a person, right? I guess it's when we kind of talk about kind of almost unschooling the relationship when school happens to be in the picture, right? You don't add your power behind the school system and the way that's set up, right? Your power is, your relationship with your child. That's what comes first and foremost. And they have a whole life, not just like school, come home, do homework, do well at school. And that's your value as a child, right? You can still step beyond that. So, I mean, you're right. I can see that from that might have been the direction that she was leaning, that school is just something that you kind of have to put up with. But they're learning all the time anyway. They're just learning what is of interest to them in their environment, right? Okay, are there any last words that you would like to share?
No, I think we probably...
we cover it, yeah.
This is part of the thing. No, it's too late now, I've spoken. No, I don't think so.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the book. Yeah, you enjoyed it too, right?
Yeah, I really did enjoy it.
Yeah. And all I would say is just keep your critical thinking engaged, right? I mean, and that's how we enjoy reading these books for the book chats, right? Thinking about what they're trying to get across. Anyway, and I wanted just to tell everybody to remember that when she uses the word parenting, she means Carpenter parenting. That took me a couple of chapters to get used to. I was like, what? Because when she's referring to Gardner style, she uses words like relationship. And so once I got used to it, I found that lovely. That was so interesting because, as we talked about earlier, as unschooling parents, we found that our relationship with our children is at the root of learning, of living day to day. So when we focus on our relationships and our connection, or attachment, everything else just blossoms from there. And I loved her point, Alison's point, maybe not in the ways that we planned or even hoped for, but in ways that are real for our children. And something that jumped out at me, it reminded me that as I learn more and more about stories and writing, that's how writers describe great endings, as unpredictable yet inevitable. We can't anticipate with any certainty where our children's interests will take them, yet when we look back, we so often see the threads that brought them there. Our lives and our children's lives really are great stories. So I just thought it was really cool how all these super different things, like unschooling kids living as if school doesn't exist, academic research into how children learn, and writing great stories, when we dive deeper into each of them, they all lead us to the same kinds of truths about being human. So I just found that really, really interesting and did enjoy the book. So I want to say thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me today, Emma. As always, I had a lot of fun digging into the ideas.
No, thank you, Pam. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. And for people who may not yet know you and your work, where can they connect with you online?
I've got a blog called rethinkingparenting.co.uk. They can contact me there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for listening. I hope you found it helpful. You might also like the backlist episodes at livingjoyfully.ca/podcast. While you're there, be sure to check out the second book in my Living Joyfully with Unschooling series, Free to Live, Create a Thriving Unschooling Home. In it, I dive into the 4 characteristics that I found helped unschooling flourish in our home: curiosity, patience, strong relationships, and trust. One reviewer wrote, "Really enjoyed this short and sweet book. It has marvelous one-liners, and though I'm not an underliner, I found myself underlining on every page." Another said, "I believe it would benefit any homeschooler or parent to read this book, as it re-emphasizes the importance of the relationship between a parent and a child in the learning process. I plan to reread this book. It is rich and full of gems. Give yourself some time to absorb it before rushing into unschooling." Until next time, have fun living and learning with your family.